Power tools use many ball bearings to allow various components to rotate. Over time, a ball bearing will wear and begin to fail. A bearing that is failing will usually give warning, often with a squeaking or a squealing sound. Replacing a ball bearing is a repair that you can do yourself, and I'm going to show you how.
Hi, I'm Mark Socha.
Do-it-yourself repairs like these are easier than you might think. From lawn machines to cordless drills, kitchen mixers,
Outdoor grills.
our how-to videos walk you through each repair from start to finish. So doing it yourself means never having to do it alone.
Let's get started.
I'll begin by removing the top cover from the engine. I'll go ahead and remove the spark plug as well. Now I'll remove the air filter cover, the air filter, and I'll remove the air filter base and carburetor. Behind the carburetor, I'll disconnect the ignition wires. And now I'll remove the fuel tank. Next, I'll remove the plastic housing beneath the muffler. And now I can separate the clutch housing and shaft from the engine. With the engine separated, now I'll remove the ignition coil, the carburetor insulator, and the muffler. Now I can separate the cylinder from the crankcase. Next, I'll remove the clutch and the flywheel. I'll use a pair of adjustable pliers to grab the clutch, and I'll bind the piston against the crankcase. And I'll remove the flywheel key. I'll use a punch to remove the key. And now I can remove the starter and the starter cup. Now remove the screws that secure the two halves of the crankcase together. You want to be careful as you do this. There's many sharp edges on these metal pieces. I'll use a rubber mallet to strike against the crankshaft and separate the two halves. And I'll remove the gasket. With the crankshaft removed, now I can remove the oil seals. Next, I'll remove the bearings. I'll use a socket that has a diameter about the same as the inner race. I'll place the first half of the crankcase housing against the anvil on my vise. It's important that you set this surface on something that is nice and flat. I don't want to damage this surface because it's a sealing surface. Also, the small side of the crankcase has two locator pins. I'll make sure I place those pins over the edge of the anvil so I don't damage anything. And I'll do the same thing with the other half of the crankcase. Now I can install the new bearing. I've flipped the housing over and again placed it on the anvil. I'll align the bearing with the housing and use my rubber mallet to just get it started into the opening. Now I'll use a socket that has a diameter about the same as the outer race to tap the bearing into place. And I'll do the same thing on the other half. This larger piece of the housing I need to place on top of my vise jaws, as it's too big for the anvil. When replacing the bearings, it's a good idea to also replace the oil sills. You'll likely damage the sill removing them anyway. I'll align the sill with the housing and use a socket to tap it into place. I want to be careful that I don't drive the sill too far into the housing, as there's nothing to stop it. I'll install the sill until it's just slightly below the surface of the flange. Now I can reinstall the crankcase seal. You may want to go ahead and replace this gasket to ensure that you get a good seal between the two halves of the crankcase. If there's any damage, you'll need to replace it. I'll align the seal with the locating pins on either side of the housing. If the seal is slightly warped like this one is, you can apply a little oil to it to get it to lay down against the housing. Now I can reinstall the crankshaft and piston assembly. I'll apply some oil to the crankshaft and insert the small end into the small housing. Now I'll install the large portion of the housing over the long end of the connecting rod. And as I bring the two halves together, it's important that I verify the location of the gasket. I'll place this assembly on top of my vise jaws, and I've opened the jaws just enough so the shaft can pass between them. At this point, I'm also going to go ahead and start the screws that secure the two halves, and this will help me to keep the gasket properly oriented. At this point, I'll rotate the crankshaft by hand and feel how tight it is. It's quite tight, which means more than likely one side of the crankshaft is touching against the housing. I'll inspect the gaps, and this side looks a little tighter than this side. So I'll tap on the shaft lightly, check it again, that's a little better, and I'll just adjust it as needed. That feels pretty good. I'll go ahead and tighten up the screws. There's a small piece of the paper gasket that will extend up past the surface of the crankcase. These are there to help you align it as you install it. I'll go ahead and rip them off. Next, I'll use a screwdriver to apply a little oil to each of the bearings. Make sure you're using a clean screwdriver so you don't introduce dirt into the crankcase. Now begin reinstalling the flywheel. First, the flywheel key. Now I can install the flywheel and the clutch. On the opposite side, I'll reinstall the starter cup. And the starter. Now I can reinstall the cylinder. As I reinstall the cylinder, it's a good idea to go ahead and replace the gasket. The gasket you remove will likely be damaged. I'll place the gasket on top of the crankcase housing. You'll notice there's a notch on one side of the housing, and I'll align the notch in the gasket in that location. Make sure you get it flipped the right direction so it lines up with the screw holes. Now I'll apply some oil to the piston and to the inside of the cylinder. There's an arrow on the top of the piston. That arrow needs to align with the exhaust port on the cylinder. The piston ring end gap needs to align with the metal post inserted in the side of the piston. Now I'll compress the piston ring as I slide the cylinder over the piston. Once in place, I'll re-secure it with the screws. Now reinstall the muffler and the carburetor isolator. You'll want to inspect the gaskets and replace them as needed. Now reinstall the ignition coil. I'll rotate the flywheel so the flywheel magnets are pointing up towards the top of the cylinder. I need to set a gap between the ignition coil and the magnets. The proper gap in this case is 14 thousandths of an inch. I have a gapping tool, which is nothing more than a piece of plastic that's that dimension. I'll place the gapping tool between the ignition coil and the magnets and install the screws. Before I tighten the screws, I'll make sure the ignition coil is pushed firmly against the gapping tool and that it's over the top of the magnets. Then I can tighten the screws. Now I can reinstall the engine to the clutch and shaft assembly. Now reinstall the fuel tank. Next, I'll reinstall the carburetor and the air filter base. And again, I'll be careful to not over-tighten these screws so I don't crack the insulator. I'll reconnect the ignition wires. Fold them over and secure them underneath with the wire holder. Now I'll reinstall the plastic housing that goes beneath the muffler. I'll reinstall the air filter and the air filter cover. I'll reinstall the motor cover and I'll finish up by reinstalling the spark plug. And that's how easy it is to install new ball bearings on your outdoor power equipment. Be sure to check back often for new videos and expert advice. If you found this video helpful, give us a thumbs up
And leave a comment.